No Ordinary Time by Doris Kearns Goodwin. Before reading this, I hadn't actually known that Franklin was elected for a third term and a fourth, which was never before seen in the history of the states. The highlights were, I guess, how Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill really solidified their friendship. And there were times that Churchill visited the White House and Franklin would need to go rest after his visits because Churchill was, I guess, a little bit wild with his routine. And really, the way FDR supported Britain in their need for supplies and the way that he sent guns and tanks and vehicles to Britain, and there was no selfishness. He knew that to support your allies is the best way to see the war come to an end. 62, and I've learned so much more about the Lend-Lease program, where Franklin pretty much decided, we're gonna supply these arms and these desperately needed supplies to Britain, and they can pay back in kind once the war is over, and not expecting, anything back right away. Page 62. It was a daring decision. At lunch with Harold Ickes, Roosevelt admitted that he might be wrong in his estimate of Allied strength. And if I should guess wrong, he said, the results might be serious. If Britain and France were to fall, the precious American supplies would be taken over by Germany, and the U.S. would be even further diminished in strength. On the other hand, he agreed with the Allied High Command that one airplane sent to the Allies now will be worth more than 10 sent in 6 weeks, and more than 100 sent in 6 months. By the morning of May 24th, German panzer units were only 15 miles from Dunkirk. Dunkirk and the British Expeditionary Force appeared to be Hitler's for the asking. But then, before the final blow could be struck, the advance of the German panzer troops was suddenly called off. This strange, totally unexpected halt remains incomprehensible, Hitler's first great mistake of the war. Believing it would be best to recover and regroup before bringing the campaign to a final victory, Hitler ordered a 3-day rest, just enough time for the Allies to put in place the massive evacuation that became known as the Miracle of Dunkirk. And it says, page 63, the miraculous evacuation produced an upsurge of hope in the American people as well, a renewal of belief that Britain, with the aid of American supplies, might yet defeat Germany. An opinion poll taken the week after Churchill's speech revealed a 43% increase in the numbers who favored the sale of planes to the Allies. Page 64. Roosevelt responded the following day, promising Churchill that he was doing everything in his power to make it possible for the Allied governments to obtain all the munitions on his list, including the latest type of aircraft. Only the destroyers presented a significant problem, Roosevelt advised, for a step of that kind could not be taken except with the specific authorization of the Congress, and this was not the right time to make such a move. In the days that followed, Roosevelt directed his military chiefs to examine Churchill's list of urgent needs and do whatever was needed to send Britain everything they possibly could. He justified his decision on the basis of his own 6-month scenario. In this remarkably prescient document, Roosevelt predicted against all odds that by the winter of 1940-41, with the help of the U.S. in supplying munitions, Britain would still be intact, and the French government would be resisting in North Africa, and Russia and Japan would still be inactive. It says how the army chiefs were not necessarily as supportive as Roosevelt was of sending supplies to Britain. It said, 65, considering the sorry state of the Army Air Force, they believe that virtually anything sent abroad would jeopardize America's national security. I regret to tell you, Marshall told Morgenthau, whom the president had designated as his representative in securing aid for the Allies, I do not think we can afford to accommodate the British government. Speaking more bluntly, General Walter Bedell Smith warned that if we were required to mobilize after having released guns necessary to this mobilization and were found to be short in artillery material, then everyone who was a party to the deal might hope to be found hanging from a lamppost. Still, Roosevelt insisted on sending munitions to Britain, standing firm against the unanimous opinion of his military advisors. On the Senate floor, Senator Nye of North Dakota called for the president's resignation, charging that the Roosevelt policy of aid to the Allies was nothing but the most dangerous adventurism. And I mean, they're arguing that they don't want their own army forces, which in 1940 they did not have an overflowing capacity of these weapons. So the argument is that sending off our weapons is cutting into our own supply, really. Page 66. At every step, the president's intervention was needed. I'm delighted to have the list of surplus materials, Roosevelt told Morgenthau on June 6th. Give it an extra push every morning and every night until it is on the ships. Page 67. For weeks, Edward Stettinius later observed, while England's war factories worked night and day to make up the losses, there were few guns in all of Britain that could stop a tank besides the 975s from America. The 80,000 Lewis, Marlin, Browning, and Vickers machine guns strengthened the defenses of every threatened beachhead and every road leading in from the coast. They went to men who almost literally had no arms at all in the most critical hour of Britain's history since the Spanish Armada sailed into the English Channel. And they talk about on page 70, Roosevelt sensing that there's a shift in the public viewing this war, and there's some pessimists who think, there could be no Allied victory. It says, the French collapse produced a sharp drop in American hopes for an Allied victory. By the end of June, only a third of the American people believed Britain would win the war. Though a majority still continued to favor sending aid to the Allies, the level of support was dropping. General Marshall and Admiral Stark were now convinced that they had been right all along. 5 days after the surrender, they urged the president to discontinue all aid to Britain at once and transfer most of the fleet from the Pacific to the Atlantic. The president flatly rejected both proposals. In what is considered one of his most decisive pre-war moves, he decreed that aid to Britain would proceed and that the fleet would stay at Pearl Harbor. And it said, though he had seen support for the Allies fluctuate with the news from abroad, he sensed a significant shift in the public mood. Isolationism still remained a powerful force, but a majority of Americans were beginning to understand that they could no longer escape from commitment, that they had a role to play in the world. For the moment, they were willing to extend themselves only so far. Their chief goal in aiding the Allies was to keep the U.S. out of the war. But for now, that was as far as Roosevelt needed or even wanted to go. I also didn't know that the president had a vehicle made for him specially by Ford. Page 119. One of the president's sweetest pleasures was to get behind the wheel of his special automobile, which had been designed for him by Ford so that it could be operated by hand levers instead of foot pedals. From all accounts, however, Roosevelt was a dreadful driver, so bad that many of his friends and relatives, including Eleanor, refused to ride with him. Thinking about the fact that he, overcame just the weight of what it would mean to have polio and to lose the use of your legs, and he still persevered and was able to be as strong as ever. And in most speeches I learned he would try to give his speeches from a standing position and use braces to help him stand. But really needed to be lifted into the car and things like that, and had no use of his legs. And he was always just determined to not let that stop him. Eleanor and FDR, they seemed like this interesting team, because there were times where Eleanor was pushing Franklin to pay attention to this certain issue. If it was a discriminatory policy involving Black people, or aiding the Jewish refugees who needed somewhere to go and making it easier for them to get out of the country, which they explained that she had regretted she couldn't do more to help them. But really that Eleanor kind of even knew herself that she would sometimes be pushing at the president, or always bringing something up to him, and not allowing herself to be just brushed aside. Page 95, I liked how they talked about just Eleanor was a very fierce woman. It was her father who acquainted Eleanor with grief, Joe Lash has written, but he also gave her the ideals that she tried to live up to all her life by presenting her with a picture of what he wanted her to be: noble, studious, religious, loving, and good. "We do not have to become heroes overnight," Eleanor once wrote. "Just a step at a time, meeting each thing that comes up, seeing it is not as dreadful as it appears, discovering that we have the strength to stare it down." So, step by step, Eleanor willed herself to become the accomplished daughter her father had decreed her to be, the fearless woman that would make him proud. Every inch of her journey was filled with peril and anxiety, but she never stopped moving forward. "The thing to always remember," she said, "is that you must do the thing you think you cannot do." I loved reading about, just the way that Roosevelt, worked with Winston Churchill to make sure that Britain had what they needed. 192. On the morning of December 9th, a seaplane touched down with a letter from Winston Churchill. Having composed it over a period of weeks, Churchill regarded the letter as one of the most important he had ever written. "My dear Mr. President," Churchill began, "as we reach the end of this year, I feel you will expect me to lay before you the prospects for 1941. I do so strongly and confidently." At the outset, he wanted the president to understand that while Britain could endure the shattering of our dwellings and the slaughter of our civil population by indiscriminate air attacks, she was facing a less sudden and less spectacular but equally deadly danger: economic strangulation. Unless we can establish our ability to feed this island, to import the munitions of all kinds which we need, we may fall by the way, and the time needed by the U.S. to complete her defensive preparations may not be forthcoming. Last of all, he came to the knotty problem that was on everyone's mind, the problem of finances. The moment approaches where we shall no longer be able to pay cash for shipping and other supplies. While we will do our utmost and shrink from no proper sacrifices to make payments across the exchange, I believe you will agree that it would be wrong in principle and mutually disadvantageous in effect if, at the height of this struggle, Britain were to be divested of all saleable assets, so that after the victory was won with our blood, civilization saved, and the time gained for the United States to be fully armed against all eventualities, we should stand stripped to the bone. Such a course would not be in the moral or economic interests of either of our countries. Churchill's letter had a profound effect on the president, though he said little about it at first. "I didn't know for quite a while what he was thinking about, if anything," Hopkins said later. "But then I began to get the idea that he was refueling, the way he so often does when he seems to be resting and carefree, so I didn't ask him any questions. Then one evening he suddenly came out with it, the whole program. He didn't seem to have any clear idea how it could be done legally, but there wasn't a doubt in his mind that he'd find a way to do it." The president's whole program, later to be known as Lend-Lease, was the unconventional idea that the U.S. could send Britain weapons and supplies without charge, and then after the war be repaid not in dollars but in kind. How Roosevelt arrived at this ingenious idea, which cut through all the stale debates in Washington about loans and gifts, is not clear. Nobody that I know of, White House speechwriter Robert Sherwood has written, has been able to give any convincing idea of how the refueling process worked. He did not seem to talk much about the subject in hand, or to consult the advice of others, or to read up on it. One can only say that FDR, a creative artist in politics, had put in his time on this cruise, evolving the pattern of a masterpiece. On page 255, it talks about Churchill giving an impassioned speech about the need to defeat Hitler, and that if any aid can be given to Russia, it should be. And it says, Roosevelt, in contrast, exercised a cautious policy of making haste slowly, keeping in touch with the unfolding events but maintaining a public silence. Roosevelt had good reason to move slowly. For one thing, his cabinet was divided on how to respond to the Russian invasion. Whereas Ix and Hull believed in giving Russia all possible aid, Stimson and Knox, along with General Marshall and the entire general staff, were convinced that Russia would be unable to contain Hitler. Scarce American equipment sent in haste to the Soviet Union would simply fall in Germany's hands. Better, Stimson argued, to use this precious and unforeseen period of respite to redouble our aid to England and push with the utmost vigor our movements in the Atlantic theater of operations. He meets with the press June 24th, and it says that he makes it sound easy, that of course they're going to give aid, all the aid they can to Russia. And he just needed to know more of what they needed, because indeed, so scant were the diplomatic reports from Russia that he probably knew less of what was going on in Moscow at this time than any desk man in any newspaper office. And even after a specific list was obtained, he emphasized, we can't simply go to Mr. Garfinkel's to fill the order. So he sends Harry Hopkins to go see what's going down and to meet with Stalin. And Hopkins is Roosevelt's advisor. And gosh, the things Hopkins goes through when he's going through these health issues, but still traveling to Britain, to Russia, all around the world pretty much. He was such a good friend to the president. And you learn about the relationship, his secretary, Missy LeHand, who was by his side the first election, and she unfortunately becomes ill and has a stroke and is no longer able to stay at the White House and be that close confidant and friend to Roosevelt. I learned how a lot of the perception of Eleanor Roosevelt that was critical, a lot of people saying that she's just kind of a busybody, and if she would just stay at home and take care of things at home, that would be better off. But really, you know, she was just advocating for the causes she believed in. And there were times where she talked about she had so many social engagements, but even in a room full of people would sometimes feel alone, because she was out there on these pursuits of, you know, social justice, and not always having someone close to her. But she did have this close relationship with her daughter, Anna. I loved hearing just about the life that, you know, Roosevelt had, as well as Eleanor. You know, like Eleanor had her own place at Valkill, and Roosevelt loved to go to Warm Springs in Georgia, where he would spend time with polio patients and get some sun and relax. And, you know, he used that leisure time to sort of recuperate and come back to sanity and normalcy because of all the pressures. Page 305 is where Churchill's visiting the White House. And it was lovely just reading about. Churchill says, "We live here as a big family," Churchill telegraphed Labour Party leader Clement Attlee, "in the greatest intimacy and informality, and I have formed the very highest regard and admiration for the President. His breadth of view, resolution, and his loyalty to the common cause are beyond all praise." On Christmas Eve, the Prime Minister joined the President in the traditional Christmas tree lighting ceremonies. The President had insisted on having the tree, despite the worries of the Secret Service, though he had agreed to relocate it from Lafayette Park to the southern grounds of the White House. Though the lights would still bring danger, historian William Seal observed in the President's house, the Secret Service could at least better protect the President this way. Standing at the President's right on the south portico with the Marine Band playing Joy to the World, the Prime Minister smiled broadly as the President pressed the button which set the colored lights of the Christmas tree twinkling. As the crowd roared its approval, the President introduced his old and good friend to say a word to the people of America. The great orator did not disappoint. "Let the children have their night of fun and laughter," he began. "Let the gifts of Father Christmas delight their thoughts. Let us share to the full in their unstinted pleasure before we turn again to the stern tasks in the year that lies before us. But now, by our sacrifice and daring, these same children shall not be robbed of their inheritance or denied their right to live in a free and decent world." Churchill wore a knee-length double-breasted coat, buttoned high in seaman fashion. He gripped a walking stick to which was attached a flashlight for the purpose of navigating London blackouts. "He reminded me of a big English bulldog who had been taught to give his paw," Mrs. Hamlin observed. On the second day of his visit, the Prime Minister had joined the President in an extraordinary dual press conference. Wearing a polka-dot bow tie, a short black coat, and striped trousers, he stared imperturbably into space, his long cigar between his compressed lips, as Roosevelt spoke. When the time came for him to speak, reporters in the back of the crowded room called out that they could not see him. Asked to stand, he not only complied, but scrambled atop his chair. There was a wild burst of applause and then cheering, the New York Times reported, as the visitor stood there before them, somewhat shorter than many had expected, but with confidence and determination written on the countenance so familiar to the world. Yes, this is the Arcadia Conference, is what they call these talks that they had during Christmas. Page 302. Churchill's telling the butler, Alonzo Fields, what he needs. "Now, Fields," Churchill began, his bare feet sticking out below his long underwear, his crumpled bedclothes scattered on the bed, the floor strewn with British and American newspapers. "We had a lovely dinner last night, but I have a few orders for you. We want to leave here as friends, right? So I need you to listen. 1, I don't like talking outside my quarters. 2, I hate whistling in the corridors. And 3, I must have a tumbler of sherry in my room before breakfast, a couple glasses of scotch and soda before lunch, and French champagne and 90-year-old brandy before I go to sleep at night." And Eleanor, I guess, wasn't as gung-ho about the staying up late. You know, she wasn't as big of a fan of Churchill's schedule when he was there. "Mother would just fume," Elliot recorded, their son, "and go in and out of the room making hints about bed, and still Churchill would sit there." It almost seemed, Elliot believed, as if Churchill were deliberately goading Eleanor by keeping Franklin up, drinking brandy and smoking cigars. Pearl Harbor happens December 7th. Roosevelt also reaffirmed America's commitment to Lend-Lease. In an emergency action on the night of Pearl Harbor, the Army had stopped the movement of all supplies to Britain and Russia in order to ensure that its own needs would be met. Hitler's propagandists triumphantly announced to the world that America's supply line had been cut off. But at the Arcadia Conference, Roosevelt declared that America's entry into the war would bring an increase, not a decrease, in Lend-Lease supplies. Page 172. There was the issue of Black people and their role within the Army and the Navy, and that they were subject to this segregation that was unfair because they were being doubted, and even when they were excelling at what they would do, they were not given the same opportunities. The community rallies for this promotion of Colonel Benjamin Davis, grandson of a slave, to brigadier general, and the appointment of William Hastie, Dean of Howard Law School, as a civilian aide to Secretary Stimson. And Roosevelt announces the promotion of Colonel Benjamin Davis when he hears that this is what is wanted within the community. And despite other people around him, like Stimson, being skeptical of what this means. And he appoints Dean William Hastie to the War Department. And it says Stimson considered both appointments a terrible mistake. Roosevelt was able to take big decisions, especially in the case of, businesses being given contracts for the military. And it says, though Roosevelt did not share Stimson's unqualified enthusiasm for business, he did agree that the primary task at hand was to convert industries of peace into industries of war. And to this end, he was willing to give business what it wanted, even if it meant capitulating on the tax bill. I regret to say, Ickes recorded in his diary, the president is willing to take what Congress will give him, and Congress will give him only what big business is willing that he should have. Army historians contend that the passage of the amortization law was a major turning point in the mobilization process. The rapid write-off provision converted high tax rates from a liability into an asset, inducing business to retain its earnings in the form of expanded plant and equipment. With tax rates at their peak, the historians argue, the success of the amortization privilege shattered conventional beliefs that high tax rates would inevitably lead to drying up of capital. But because small business was hurt by this tax legislation, because it says, as the defense program got underway, military procurement agencies turned more and more to big business. A study released the following summer indicated that in the first year of the mobilization, 56 large corporations accounted for 3/4 of the dollar value of all prime contracts. We had to take industrial America as we found it, War Department Under Secretary Robert Pattinson explained. And it says, in the months ahead, as the cries of small businessmen began to be heard on Capitol Hill, new legislation would be enacted to try to increase the relative share of small business in total Army procurement. But by then, the basic pattern, the link between big business and the military establishment, a link that would last long into the post-war era and lead to a future president to warn against the military-industrial complex, was already set. Congress granted the president the legislation he needed to begin the process of mobilization, and with it the revitalization of the American economy after a decade of depression. And that, during the years that these factories are producing for the war effort, that it took them out of the depression economy. Doris Kearns Goodwin included great details about there was this cook at the White House, Henrietta Nesbitt, and she didn't want to make like good food. Her whole thing was just plain food, plainly served or whatever. And at one point, Roosevelt's complaining. It says, for years, the president had pleaded with Eleanor to find a new housekeeper to replace Mrs. Nesbitt. All his life, he had loved good food. He was especially fond of quail and pheasant cooked so rare as to be bloody. He loved oyster crabs, out-of-the-way country cheeses, and peach cobbler. But Mrs. Nesbitt maintained that a proper diet consisted of plain foods, plainly prepared. She served the same simple meals over and over again. The housekeeper's personal tastes governed breakfast as well. My God, the president exclaimed one morning to Grace Tully. Doesn't Mrs. Nesbitt know that there are breakfast foods besides oatmeal? It's been served to me morning in and morning out for months and months now, and I'm sick and tired of it. Later that day, he called Tully in for dictation. Leaning back in his chair, he held in his hand an advertisement for various cereals he had torn from the morning paper. Corn Flakes, 13-ounce package, 19 cents. Post Toasties, 13-ounce package, 19 cents. Cream of wheat, 2 for 27 cents. Now take this gentle reminder to Mrs. Nesbitt. Roosevelt, and then it says, like, Mrs. Nesbitt doesn't really respond to his memos. So it says he goes to Eleanor, and it says, do you remember, he asked her in a memo, that about a month ago I got sick of chicken because I got it between lunch and dinner, at least 6 times a week? The chicken situation has definitely improved, but they have substituted sweetbreads. And for the past month, I have been getting sweetbreads about 6 times a week. I'm getting to the point where my stomach positively rebels, and this does not help my relations with foreign powers. I don't want sweetbreads. No more sweetbreads. Poor Roosevelt. I mean, I guess she talked about how he rarely would ever just fire people. It took a lot for him to get rid of someone, because he definitely could have said, Nesbitt, you're out of here. I don't want your plain food. There's a point where at his inauguration dinner, I think for his the fourth time he's elected, and he wants chicken a la king served. And she says, well, there's no way we could serve it hot to all those people that are going to be there. So no way. It's going to be cold chicken salad. It's like, dudes got elected for the 4th time and you can't even try to make him chicken a la king. On page 282, when they're talking about whether or not merchant ships should be armed, because many ships were being sunk, and critics argued that the U.S. was provoking incidents at sea in order to arouse the American public. If we continue to look for trouble, Senator Robert Reynolds warned, the probabilities are that we will eventually find it. American war vessels, under orders of warlike Knox, are hunting down German subs. The American people must realize that. They are victims of a conspiracy to hurry them into the war. And it says it took 11 days for the Senate to debate amending the Neutrality Act because he wants to arm merchant ships. It says the closeness of the vote made it clear to Roosevelt that, short of some dramatic event, there was no chance of getting Congress to vote for a declaration of war against Germany. And that he just waits on events. And eventually, well, December 7th, the attack on Pearl Harbor is all that's really required for that to bring them into things. Japan could not tolerate the embargo on oil. The crisis strengthened the hand of the military. Japanese diplomats until the last day of November to arrange a satisfactory settlement with the United States that would end sanctions. If they failed, war would begin in early December. In the meantime, active preparations were underway for a massive airstrike against Pearl Harbor. The stumbling block in the negotiations was China. Whereas Japan was really willing to remove its troops from Indochina and promised not to advance beyond current positions in return for America's lifting of the embargo, she refused to withdraw completely from China. For a time, it seemed that Roosevelt would accept a partial withdrawal of Japanese troops from China, but strong protests from nationalist Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek hardened the U.S. position. Oh yeah, so 286, they talk about what Hull sends to the Japanese. The president agreed with Stark about the importance of playing for time. Though he had little hope now that an agreement could be reached, he instructed Hull to send a proposal to the Japanese demanding that Japan leave China and Indochina in return for an American promise to negotiate new trade and raw materials agreements. The note reiterated what the United States had been saying for months, that Japan could at any moment put an end to the exploding situation by embracing a peaceful course, and that once she did this, her fears of encirclement would come to an immediate end. And then he goes on his trip to Warm Springs, and that's when Hull has to call him and say things are not progressing well. His Secretary Hull phoned to say the Far East picture was darkening and that the talks in Washington were in such brittle state that they might be broken at any time. The president told Hull to call again after dinner. If things were no better, he would return to Washington. When Hull called at 9 p.m., he told Roosevelt that he had just finished reading an explosive speech which Premier Tojo was scheduled to deliver the following day. The speech called on Japan, for the honor and pride of mankind, to take immediate steps to wipe out U.S. and British exploitation in the Far East. Hull was convinced that a Japanese attack was imminent. He advised Roosevelt to return to Washington as soon as possible. The president agreed to leave the following day. On Saturday afternoon, December 6th, intelligence experts at the War and Navy departments, who had broken the secret Japanese code in July, intercepted a message from Tokyo informing the Japanese ambassador that a 14-part response to Hull's 10-point document was on its way. By early evening, the first 13 parts had been transmitted. The 14th part, Tokyo said, would be sent the following morning. When the first 13 parts were deciphered, a feeling of dread filled the air. It was obvious from the point-by-point rejection of each and every one of Hull's proposals that Japan was refusing all reconciliation. Only one glimmer of hope remained. Nowhere in the 13 points had Japan formally broken off negotiations. The improbable hope of Saturday night was crushed on Sunday morning, December 7th, when the 14th part of the Japanese message, terminating diplomatic negotiations, arrived. Within minutes, a second message came through, instructing Ambassador Kishisaburo Nomura to deliver the entire 14-part reply to Secretary Hull at precisely 1 o'clock. To Colonel Rufus Bratton, chief of the Far Eastern section of the War Department, the timing of the 1 p.m. deadline seemed significant. It says that Marshall acted swiftly, writing a priority dispatch to the various American commanders in the Pacific. The Japanese are presenting at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time today what amounts to an ultimatum. Just what significance the hour set may have, we do not know, but be on the alert. And the warning does not make it in time, because it says in order of priority, the warning was to go first to Manila, then to Panama, and finally to Hawaii. By the time the message reached the telegraph station in Honolulu, the attack on Pearl Harbor had already begun. And then 293. Historians have focused substantial time and attention trying to determine who knew what and when before the 7th of December, on the theory that Roosevelt was aware of the Japanese plans to attack Pearl Harbor, but deliberately concealed his knowledge from the commanders in Hawaii in order to bring the United States into hostilities through the back door. Unable to swing Congress and the public toward a declaration of war against Germany, critics contend, the president provoked Japan into firing the first shot and then watched with delight as the attack created a united America. To be sure, Roosevelt was concerned that, if war came, the Japanese should be the ones to initiate hostilities. Stimson records a conversation on November 25th in which the president raised the possibility that Japan might attack without warning. The question Roosevelt asked was how we should maneuver them into the position of firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves. But in the discussion, as in all others preceding Pearl Harbor, the reigning assumption was that Japan would attack from the south. Though Pearl Harbor was mentioned once the previous January in a report from the U.S. Ambassador to Japan, Joseph Grew, to the State Department, it was assumed again and again, right up to December 7th, that the Philippines was the most likely target for Japanese aggression. Common sense suggests that if the president had known beforehand about Pearl Harbor, he would have done everything he could to reposition the fleet and disperse the airplanes to ensure minimal damage. For the purposes of mobilizing the American people, one American ship torpedoed by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor would have sufficed. It is inconceivable that Roosevelt, who loved the Navy with a passion, would have intentionally sacrificed the heart of its fleet, much less the lives of 3,500 American sailors and soldiers, without lifting a finger to reduce the risk. It is an inquiry that obscures the more important question that Senator Connally posed. How did it happen that our warships were caught like tame ducks in Pearl Harbor? Page 297. In the days that followed Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt found himself in an awkward situation. He had been telling his countrymen for more than a year that Hitler's Germany was the real enemy. He had expected that Germany would join Japan in declaring war against the United States. But time was passing and still nothing was heard from Berlin. Was it possible, political scientist James McGregor Burns has written, after all Washington's elaborate efforts to fight first in Europe, with only a holding action in the Pacific, that the United States would be left with only a war in the Far East? The answer came on December 11th, when Adolf Hitler, who viewed America as a decadent democracy, incapable of making a sustained commitment to war, delivered a vitriolic speech against Roosevelt and declared war against the United States. A worldwide distance separates Roosevelt's ideas and my ideas, he began. Roosevelt comes from a rich family and belongs to the class whose path is smoothed in the democracies. I was only the child of a small, poor family and had to fight my way by work and industry. We need you, Eleanor. There's no comparing Eleanor Roosevelt. Page 416, they talk about that she really advocated for this daycare to be opened at the time when women were being called to work in the factories for the war effort, but because there was a lack of childcare, Eleanor noticed that. And 416, for months, Eleanor had been calling on private industry to recognize that providing a daycare center was as essential as providing a cafeteria. Until the needs of working mothers with young children could be fully met, she argued, there was no possibility of ensuring a stable workforce. Undeterred, Eleanor stepped up her campaign for daycare. Whether one felt it advisable or not for women to work, the fact remained that women were working. More than 3 million new women had entered the workforce between 1940 and 1942, and 3 million more were expected to enter before the war was over, bringing the total of female workers to 19 million. Oh yeah, the Kaiser Company, she works with Henry Kaiser, and that's where they talk about that there's no adequate daycare. And then she starts this wonderful Swan Island Center. where it says, the Swan Island Center was a Head Start program a quarter of a century ahead of its time. One woman came all the way from Louisiana because she heard the program was great for children. In the first year of operation, the Swan Island Center served nearly 2,000 children and opened at first for only a day in swing shifts. It soon added cots and bedding supplies to accommodate the graveyard shift, keeping its doors open 24 hours a day. The success of the Swan Island Center stimulated war plants and shipyards across the nation to provide daycare. It was established that each child care center serving 40 mothers made possible 8,000 productive man-hours monthly. The way she had her column, My Day, I just loved that, you know, people read about her life, and she was even offered the contract to extend till 1950, even once she wasn't the first lady. So Fala, that was the sweetest thing reading about Fala. When they get Fala on page 200. Fala the Scotty dog. This Christmas, the president took added pleasure in the arrival of a new puppy named Fala, a gift from his cousin Margaret Suckley. He had longed for a puppy for years, he told his cousin as he lifted the little Scottish terrier into his arms. But Eleanor did not consider the White House a proper place to bring up a dog. Roosevelt had had pets before, but Fala became his friend in a way no other pet had been. Fala accompanied the president everywhere, eating his meals in Roosevelt's study, sleeping in a chair at the foot of his bed. And when Franklin passes away, originally the plan is to have Fala be taken care of by the cousin, Margaret Suckley. But Eleanor says she would like to have Fala back because she's feeling the emptiness of the house. And it says, in the midst of her labors, Eleanor took unexpected comfort in Fala's return to the Roosevelt household. Shortly after the funeral, Jimmy Roosevelt had written Margaret Suckley and asked her to send Fala back. In talking to my sister and brother, we all feel very disappointed that Fala is not staying with Mother, Jimmy wrote. Fala was part of the family, and it would make Mother very happy to have him back. Suckley agreed, and Fala came to live at Valkill. Soon he and Eleanor became inseparable. Fala accompanied her on walks through the woods, sat beside her chair in the living room, and greeted her at the door when she came home. No one was as vociferously pleased to see me as Fala, she noted proudly after a trip to New York. And then this part it's sad, still Fala missed the president. When General Eisenhower came to Hyde Park to lay a wreath on Roosevelt's grave, Fala heard the sirens of the motorcade and thought his master was returning. His legs straightened out and his ears pricked up, Eleanor noted. He was hoping to see his master coming down the drive. Roosevelt's success in mobilizing the nation to this extraordinary level of collective performance rested on his uncanny sensitivity to his followers, his ability to appraise public feeling and to lead people one step at a time. More than any previous president, he studied public opinion. He read a variety of newspapers, he analyzed polls, he traveled the country when he could and dispatched his wife when he could not. He brought in people of clashing temperaments to secure different points of view. He probed visitors at dinner. He tried out his ideas on reporters. But more than diligence was involved. Like any great artist, Roosevelt relied on his own intuition to fit the smallest details and the most disparate impressions into a coherent pattern. He was able to sense what the people were thinking and feeling. I am like a cat, he once said. I make a quick stroke and then I relax. He was committed to the Allied cause from the start of the war, but he understood that he had to bring an isolationist people along little by little through a combination of decisions, speeches, and events. He let the reaction to the Nazi invasion of Western Europe build before he had addressed the joint session of Congress on May 16, 1940. He let a citizens group take the lead on the draft in the summer of 1940 while he focused on making the destroyer deal with Britain. Then, when it looked as though the draft would be defeated, he delivered a strong endorsement that carried the bill through. He sat quietly for days on the Tuscaloosa after receiving Churchill's urgent plea for help with Britain's financial crisis until he suddenly emerged with the idea of lending Britain weapons to be paid back in kind after the war. He resisted strong pressure to convoy ships in the spring of 1941, believing that convoys would bring America into the war before the American people were ready. Yet, once again, perfectly sensing the state of public feeling, in which the growing commitment to the Allied cause was undercut by the fear of sending American boys abroad, he dramatized the grim situation on the seas by declaring an unlimited emergency, which made it seem that he was moving further than he really was. Determined not to carry a divided country into war, he waited for events to unify the nation. The wisdom of this assessment was confirmed when the extension of the draft passed the House by only a single vote in August 1941. It would take the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor to shatter isolationism once and for all, and to create the unified support necessary to win the war. Roosevelt's sense of timing was also manifest in his actions as commander-in-chief. Once again, he knew when to invoke his powers and when to hold them in reserve. He picked a first-class military team, Marshall, King, Arnold, Leahy, and gave them wide latitude to run the war. Never once, Stimson admiringly remarked, did Roosevelt overturn his commander's decisions for personal or political motives. So Doris Kearns Goodwin talks about that she interviewed, relatives in her note on the sources where she says, "Though my story took place more than half a century ago, I was able to talk with scores of people who knew the Roosevelts and the members of their extended family personally. A list of my interviews follows." And there is probably about 100. No, my estimations are poor, but there's tons of people that she talked to. She probably talked to over like 50 or 60 people here. I love how Doris Kearns Goodwin gives some of her favorite details. And she says, "Some of my favorite details came from the press reports of the time. The women screamed from the audience as she witnessed the lottery drawing for the draft and realized that her son held the first number drawn. The observation that the president's nervousness before his press conferences resembled that of an opera singer about to go on stage. The likening of Harry Hopkins' weary look to that of an ill-fed horse at the end of a hard day." Poor Harry Hopkins, and he was amazing. Like, all he did, staying by the president's side, meeting with Stalin, Churchill, to go back in time and just to sit in the president's study in on like a Harry Hopkins and Roosevelt conversation would be very interesting. After the president had passed away, talks about Eleanor and how she gets these conversations from people she sees telling her how much they loved the president. "It has warmed my heart," she told the readers, "to discover how many people would stop and speak to me as they left the train, often murmuring only, 'We loved your husband.' On the subway in New York, a man, visibly controlling his emotion, came up to her and said, 'He was like a friend who came and talked to us every now and then.' These spontaneous outbursts of affection for my husband, from casual people whom I have never seen before, are spoken so sincerely that I often wish my husband could hear them himself." And she says, "I am sad that he could not see the end of his long work, which he carried so magnificently."